The Kremlin has confirmed that President Donald Trump will speak with the Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday as part of Trump's efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Speaking on board Air Force One, Trump said talks between US and Russian officials in the Kremlin last week had been positive. His comments come as Russia continued its assault on Ukraine with a further barrage of drone strikes over the weekend.
Amid talks of peace and ceasefire deals, the people in Ukraine are still at the mercy of Russian strikes.
I lay down, the TV was on and I fell asleep. And then there was a bang and everything fell on me, the whole ceiling. I got up, everything was covered in dust. I turned on the light and it was a mess. I couldn't see anything.
But much of what happens here in Ukraine depends on the decisions of leaders in foreign capitals. On Air Force One on Sunday night, US President Donald Trump once again raised the issue of Ukrainian land and who it might one day belong to.
It's a lot of land. It's a lot different than it was before the war, as you know. And we'll be talking about land. We'll be talking about power plants. That's up, it's a big question. But I think we have a lot of it already discussed very much by both sides.
You'll ask him.
Ukraine and Russia.
You'll ask him.
We're already talking about that, dividing up certain assets.
While Europe hopes to keep the Americans on side, it also realises that it needs to bolster its defence capabilities with its longtime ally now an unpredictable partner.
We really welcome the Jeddah talks and the result of it. Now we need to really see that the ball is in Russia's court and what kind of conditions they are presenting, which is a big question whether they want peace.
The Kremlin has confirmed that a phone conversation between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin will take place on Tuesday. But there is little optimism in Ukraine that any discussions will lead to a durable peace.
Christopher Hill is a veteran US diplomat who's served as ambassador to 4 different countries. Welcome to the day, Mr. Ambassador. Can I start by asking you whether Donald Trump has the power to browbeat Vladimir Putin into agreeing to a 30-day ceasefire?
Well, obviously, it's a completely different dynamic. On the one hand, he knows that Putin values his, how to put it, relationship with Donald Trump. He also is aware that Putin is facing rather severe economic problems. And he also sees Putin as maybe in a mood to settle since he's had some recent gains in the battlefield, especially in Kursk. And he's aware that the Ukrainians are, a small and tired nation, and he realizes he has a lot of control over the Ukrainians. So, on the other hand, I don't think the president has really studied the situation that carefully. I'm not sure he really understands the depth of feelings among Ukrainians. I don't think he understood, for example, that the performance in the White House actually helped President Zelensky more than it helped President Trump, I'm sorry. And he also has a very split Republican Party, which is primarily, at least among the internationalists, in favor of continuing to support Ukraine. So it's a rather dicey and complex picture that both he and President Putin face these days.
What do you make of Donald Trump's statement that he'll be talking to Putin about what he termed land and power plants?
Yeah, I think President Trump has a kind of persistent view that somehow this can all come down to some kind of business arrangement, and thinks that given that one of Ukraine's assets are these power plants, and given that Russia is probably going to be interested in more markets for its own raw materials, that there's a deal to be made along these lines. You recall a few weeks ago, it was all about critical minerals. That didn't really pan out as a big time picture, but I think it's the notion that President Trump is trying to assemble some elements that could go into a deal rather than the fundamental element, which is will the Russians stop coveting Ukrainian land? The fact that Russia took Crimea and everyone thought, well, that will be that. And then they came back for the rest of it. And I'm not sure that issue has been internalized by President Trump as it has been by the Ukrainian people.
So more specifically, what are the dangers in the strategy that Donald Trump has taken so far on the Ukraine war?
It's interesting for someone who really sees himself as a big-time negotiator that President Trump tends to put his concessions out there pretty early on. He basically tells his interlocutor, I'll give you this, this, and this. And I think the issue is with President Putin, he tends to pocket these things and then ask for more. So I think the real dynamic will be to show President Putin that President Trump is prepared to kind of go in the other direction and get tougher on Russia. And that is a proposition that really hasn't been observed as yet.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that Trump is trying to achieve in Ukraine ultimately? What's his primary motivation?
You know, I'm here to talk foreign policy, but I think you're asking me a psychological question about him. I think partly it has to do with his notion that if he says it's going to happen, it's going to happen, that he has a tremendous kind of clairvoyance of what can happen if you put the right tough guy in charge. So I think it's not so much about Russia and Ukraine as it is about President Trump's capacity to see a situation that no one else saw, go out, get it done, and in his own view, his image goes up.
You have vast diplomatic experience when it comes to negotiating binding deals. Do you see the chance for Trump to negotiate a lasting deal for Ukraine, given the style that he's employed so far?
I think he's probably not got the elements on the table that would get to a lasting agreement. I think a lasting agreement would be some kind of deterrence against Russia trying this again. And that deterrence usually comes in the form of some kind of security guarantees. And President Putin says he won't put up with that. And President Trump seems to agree that he won't give the kind of assurance of security assurances that would come from, say, NATO membership. So I think he's going to have a problem in that regard. And the big question, of course, is has he really kind of scoped out the situation? Does he understand that if Russia is united again with Ukraine, we've got the Soviet Union back, which is a pretty serious black mark to have on your resume as a U.S. president? I'm not sure he understands the situation in those terms. So I think it's very important for his team to continue to try to keep those lines open with the Europeans, and the Europeans understand this a lot better than, how to put it, some current Americans do.
European leaders are trying to figure out what role they can play in Ukraine. So again, what can they realistically do if the US says we're not going to, offer security guarantees?
I think this issue is of such fundamental importance to the transatlantic system, but especially to Europe, that I think it's very important for the Europeans to deepen their, first of all, their cooperation with each other. Secondly, their production of munitions and armaments. And thirdly, to be extremely active diplomatically. I think we really have reached a kind of inflection point where it's not going to be a situation where the Americans will come in at the last hour and save things. I I wouldn't count on that in the current circumstances. And so I think Europeans who've looked at the Trump presidency from the beginning and have felt there needs to be a bigger and more forceful and more consistent European role are going to be right about that. And I think they have to do that. I have no doubt that Europe can do more in this situation. I'm not talking about this tired discussion about the 2%, but I am talking about the fact that the Europeans need to deepen their military industrial base.
US diplomat Christopher Hill, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on the programme today.
Thank you.
For more on this, let's cross over to Torrey Taussig. She is an expert on the U.S.-Europe and U.S.-Russia relations at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Torrey, thanks for joining us. Do you think that Donald Trump can actually get President Putin to agree to this ceasefire tomorrow?
I think we're a long way from a durable peace and a ceasefire. Look, I think the conversation tomorrow between President Trump and President Putin is a good sign. It shows that both sides are still willing and ready to step up and talk. But the devil's in the details. You know, again, we heard from White House press secretary today say we're on the 10th yard line of a peace deal, but that is not what we are hearing from Ukraine. That is not what we are hearing from Moscow, and that is not where the Europeans think we are. So again, I think we are a bit of a ways away from a durable peace.
So the ceasefire is different from a peace deal that would end the war indefinitely, right?
So even with a ceasefire, look, I mean, President Putin has said that in order to stop the fighting, Moscow needs security guarantees or a guarantee that Kyiv will not be offered NATO membership. I think we're actually there because Washington has also ruled that out. But Moscow has also said that they would reject having NATO observers or peacekeepers on the ground, which is something that Europeans are actively working on with Kyiv. So while Washington and Kyiv are ready to initiate a 30-day ceasefire on land and in the skies, Moscow is saying that a lot more needs to be ironed out before we can even achieve a ceasefire, let alone any longer durable peace.
You mentioned Europe's role there in the beginning when Donald Trump took back the White House. Europe felt sidelined in these discussions between Russia and the U.S. Has that changed at all recently?
When it comes to the conversations between Washington and Moscow, no, I would very much say this has remained on bilateral terms. Same with the negotiations that took place in Jeddah between Ukraine and Washington. Those are still very much on a bilateral case. And that is how the administration is looking to carry this out. There has been a flurry of diplomatic activity, no doubt, between Washington, the administration, and European counterparts. We've seen that play out over the last 6 weeks of this new administration. But when it comes to negotiations between Washington and Moscow, those have remained in bilateral channels. And I think it's clear that Trump wants to negotiate with Putin, and Putin wants to negotiate with Trump. And in that sense, Europe is very much on the sidelines of that high-stakes diplomacy.
Trump has made it clear that he has accepted one of the preconditions of the negotiations, which is that Ukraine gives up territory, makes concessions. Will European allies of Ukraine ever accept this?
So I think from early on in these ceasefire talks, or talks to even achieve a 30-day ceasefire, Europe, Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow have had a shared understanding that there's going to be a compromise over territory. You know, currently, I think Moscow controls about 20% of Ukraine's territory. There was an understanding very early on that we heard from the Secretary of Defense, that we've heard from the President, that Kyiv, that Zelensky is going to have to compromise on territory. Right. I think if Ukraine is there and if Washington is there, I have not heard any pushback from Europe on that front, but there are several other details that we would need for a ceasefire beyond compromising on land.
Okay, thanks so much for your analysis. Torrey Taussig of the Atlantic Council.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's cross straight to Kyiv and speak to DW correspondent Nick Connolly. Nick, EU foreign ministers meeting today in Brussels to discuss Ukraine and Trump's talks with Putin, of course. Does Ukraine feel it has the EU's full support at this really critical moment?
I think Ukrainians are used to the fact that these European institutions aren't good at doing a kind of PR big bang, aren't good at providing these kind of set piece opportunities and having announcements all lined up. They understand that usually it works in a more incremental way, a few billion here, a few billion there, that there is obviously division within the bloc. The Hungarians particularly very critical of upping military aid to Ukraine, but I think certainly the fact that we've had Kaja Kallas talking the last few days about 40 billion euros worth of military aid to Ukraine this year, that is very welcome. And we've had Ursula von der Leyen the last couple of months again reinforcing her belief that she thinks Ukraine can join the EU before 2030. So there is a sense that Europe is here for the long term. The EU membership, unlike NATO membership, is realistic, is going to happen, and sooner rather than later. But I think the kind of overwhelming kind of headline of the last couple of hours hasn't been what's happening in Brussels. It's been about London, about Keir Starmer in the UK saying that the UK is willing to send peacekeepers potentially for an open-ended amount of time to guarantee any kind of ceasefire to make sure that Russia doesn't come back again. That is something that is really seen as a real move forward and a willingness to basically sign up for something that could potentially be politically quite difficult internally in the UK, but a sense that European countries, if they're not in the EU, are willing to invest this kind of political capital in keeping Ukraine safe if America is no longer the guarantor of Ukraine's safety.
Now, Trump and Putin are set to speak on the phone tomorrow. Again, what are people in Ukraine expecting from this call? I mean, are they worried that Ukraine is going to be pushed to make big concessions?
I mean, we've gone from a situation where America was very clearly Ukraine's ally under Biden to a situation where Trump talks about wanting to be a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. But in terms of his actions, lots of people are convinced that he's actually closer to Russia than he is to Ukraine. He's spoken about the fact that he thinks it's been easier for him dealing with the Russians than with the Ukrainians. Now I think it's time for him to show that he's willing to put some pressure on Russia from a Ukrainian perspective, because we've all seen the pressure he's put on Volodymyr Zelensky. But so far, at least rhetorically, there's been very little in terms of asks from the Russian side. Now that is the chance to make that happen and to say what demands the American side has of Russia. So far, we're just seeing the Kremlin constantly upping basically what they want before they're going to agree to any ceasefire. Ukraine has said it is willing to do this 30-day ceasefire that Trump has put forward. Lots of questions coming back from Moscow, lots of conditions they're putting on it. So, yeah, an opportunity for Trump to show that he is genuinely a mediator and not just an ally of Moscow's.
DW's Nick Connolly reporting from Kyiv. Nick, thanks so much. Dozens of military chiefs are due to meet in the UK this week to thrash out the details of an international ceasefire enforcement mission to Ukraine. This follows a virtual leaders' meeting hosted by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer at the weekend. He and the French President Emmanuel Macron are leading efforts to establish the so-called coalition of the willing. Its aim is to provide Ukraine with security guarantees in the event of a ceasefire deal and to deter Russia from violating it. Moscow has repeatedly made clear that it is hostile to the idea of a multinational force in Ukraine. And we can get more from our correspondent in London, Birgit Maass. Birgit, tell us first of all more about the plans for this coalition of the willing. What kind of support is expected to be agreed on here?
We're still waiting for more details. We don't know yet how many soldiers Keir Starmer and the other leaders in the so-called coalition of the willing are thinking of, and also what exactly they will do. Will they be on the ground? Will they be on the front line? Or will they be monitoring from the air with drones, for example? So we know that there will be more flesh on the ground that needs to be provided. We've had a senior retired British Army General, Lord Dennett, on the record saying that really the roles of engagement of this eventual coalition are far from clear now.
OK, and then we've got military chiefs meeting in London on Thursday to discuss next steps, apparently, in terms of operational planning. So do we know what might come out of that meeting?
Well, that's exactly it, Anya. So Keir Starmer wants to assume some sort of leadership position. He's really pushing for something that he calls practical plans. But we also know that so far it's him and France who have committed to some form of boots on the ground. But Keir Starmer is always maintaining that there needs to be also US support. He keeps talking about a backstop that needs to be provided by the US. And so far, it seems that the US is rather reluctant to provide this backstop. So this is a big obstacle when it comes to the so-called coalition of the willing. And when military chiefs are meeting here in London on Thursday, that will be one of the biggest obstacles also in their way when it comes to fleshing out the plans and agreeing to what exactly the soldiers will do and how many soldiers and what capacity will go and monitor a ceasefire if that actually materializes.
And Prime Minister Starmer has a visitor this evening, doesn't he? He's also going to be meeting with the new Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, after Mark Carney visited the French president in Paris earlier today. Do we know what they're going to be talking about?
Well, it's a hugely symbolic visit. Normally, a Canadian Prime Minister would be expected to go to the US. However, Mark Carney has chosen to go to France and the UK first. This obviously has the background of the rhetoric that's coming from the US and President Trump claiming Canada as the US's 51st state. So in a way, Mark Carney is looking for solidarity elsewhere. And when he was in France, he said that Canada was the most European of non-European countries. So it's somehow a form of solidarity that he will be looking for from Starmer and Macron. But so far, at least when it comes to the UK, Keir Starmer and also the Foreign Secretary David Lammy have been quite careful to avoid any confrontation when it comes to what exactly Canada's position is. So they've been quite diplomatic and not wanting to really anger President Trump when it comes to the relations with Canada.
Birgit, thanks so much for bringing us up to date. That's DW's Birgit Maass in London.